Adrian Walker never intended to fall in love with someone who did not belong to him. He was not reckless, not impulsive, and certainly not the kind of man who chased impossible dreams. At 32, his life was structured, predictable, quiet. He worked as an architect in a firm that valued precision over passion, symmetry over chaos. His apartment was minimalistic, almost sterile, clean lines, muted colors, controlled spaces. That was how he preferred things. Controlled, measured, safe. And then Olivia Hayes moved into the apartment across the hall. She arrived on a gray November afternoon, carrying too many boxes and wearing a coat that looked slightly too thin for the cold. Adrian noticed her before he meant to. Not because she was loud. She wasn't. Not because she demanded attention. She didn't. It was something quieter than that. A softness in the way she apologized to the delivery driver for the narrow stairwell. A faint, distracted smile when she dropped her keys. A tiredness behind her eyes that didn't match her age. He helped her pick up a stack of books that had slipped from an open box. Their hands brushed for barely a second, but it was enough to disrupt the careful balance of his world. She thanked him, introduced herself, and smiled politely. Nothing extraordinary. Nothing dramatic. Just two neighbors meeting for the first time. But that night, Adrian found himself replaying the moment in his mind. The sound of her voice, the warmth of her hand, the way she avoided eye contact when she felt shy. He told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. Their connection began in small, harmless ways. Elevator rides at 8:15 in the morning. Casual greetings in the hallway. Shared complaints about the building's unreliable heating system. Adrian learned that Olivia worked remotely as an editor for a publishing company. She loved classical music, strong coffee, and rainy weather. She laughed quietly, like she was afraid of taking up too much space. At first, Adrian convinced himself he was simply being neighborly. But soon, he began adjusting his routine to match hers. He left for work 5 minutes earlier because that was when she usually stepped into the elevator. He lingered in the hallway when he heard her door open. He memorized the rhythm of her footsteps. He noticed everything. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. The way her shoulders stiffened whenever her phone buzzed. The way her smile faded just slightly after reading certain messages. One evening, as they stood side by side watching rain fall against the building's entrance windows, she mentioned him. "Marcus and I have been together for 4 years," she said casually, staring at the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement. Long distance for most of it. Marcus. The name settled heavily in Adrian's chest. For years. Long distance. Complicated. She didn't elaborate, but she didn't need to. Adrian could see it in her expression, love mixed with exhaustion. Commitment tangled with doubt. He nodded, pretending calm, pretending indifference. But that night, sleep refused to come. As winter deepened, so did their closeness. It happened gradually, almost invisibly. She began knocking on his door for trivial reasons, asking to borrow sugar, to complain about her internet connection, to escape the loneliness of her own apartment. Adrian welcomed every excuse. They started sharing tea in his kitchen, then dinner, then long conversations that stretched past midnight. She spoke about Marcus often, not with passion, but with obligation. She described the early days of their relationship with warmth, but when she spoke of the present, her voice grew distant. "It's just hard," she would say. "Sometimes I feel like I'm the only one trying." Adrian listened carefully, painfully aware of the line he could not cross. He wanted to tell her that love shouldn't feel like begging. He wanted to tell her she deserved to be chosen loudly. He wanted to tell her that every time she smiled at him, something inside him ignited. But instead, he offered neutral advice, supportive words, safe comfort. And in doing so, he built a prison of his own making. Because loving someone silently is not noble. It is slow torture. The shift came on a cold February night when Olivia knocked on his door with trembling hands. Marcus had visited that weekend. They had argued. Not explosively, not dramatically, just the kind of quiet argument that reveals deeper fractures. The kind that doesn't end with resolution, only silence. She sat on Adrian's couch, staring at nothing. "I don't know if he sees me anymore," she whispered. "It feels like I'm talking into a void." Adrian's heart pounded so loudly he was afraid she might hear it. He wanted to hold her. He wanted to confess. He wanted to be the answer. Instead, he sat beside her, close enough to feel her warmth, far enough to remain safe, and said softly, You deserve to be seen. Her eyes met his then, and for the first time, something flickered there. Not gratitude, not friendship, awareness. The air between them thickened, charged, fragile. She didn't pull away when his hand brushed hers. Neither of them spoke. But in that silence, everything changed. When Marcus announced he was moving to the city permanently, Adrian felt the world tilt. Olivia tried to sound hopeful, but doubt shadowed her expression. Maybe this is what we need, she said, more to herself than to him. Adrian nodded, forcing a smile that felt like glass in his throat. Jealousy is an ugly emotion when you have no right to feel it. He hated himself for resenting a man he had never met. Hated himself for wanting her relationship to fail. Hated himself for calculating possibilities in the quiet corners of his mind. But what terrified him most was this. If Marcus fought for her, truly fought, would Olivia ever look at Adrian the same way again? The next week, she invited him to dinner. With Marcus, she added. And Adrian agreed. Because loving someone secretly means accepting pain with dignity. He sat across from the man who technically had everything Adrian wanted. Marcus was charismatic, confident, attentive in public ways. But Adrian noticed the interruptions, the subtle dismissals, the way Olivia's laughter sounded slightly forced. And once, just once, she looked at Adrian across the table as if asking a silent question. That look kept him breathing through the rest of the evening. After the dinner, something invisible shifted in Olivia. It wasn't dramatic enough for outsiders to notice, but Adrian felt it immediately. She became quieter whenever Marcus was mentioned. Her voice lost conviction when she spoke about working things out. And yet, she still tried. Adrian watched her try, watched her cling to the history they had built, the years invested, the promises made when distance still felt romantic instead of exhausting. He admired her loyalty even as it slowly broke him. They continued their routine. Morning greetings, shared coffee, late-night conversations. But now there was tension layered beneath everything, an awareness that neither dared to name. When their shoulders brushed in the hallway, neither moved quickly. When their eyes held a fraction too long, both looked away at the same time. Adrian felt himself splitting in two. One part of him wanted to protect her relationship out of respect. The other part wanted to fight for her, to finally step out of the shadows and claim what his heart had already chosen. But timing is cruel, and love that arrives at the wrong moment can feel like betrayal. So he waited, and waiting became its own form of suffering. It happened on a night heavy with rain and unresolved tension. Olivia had planned to spend the evening with Marcus in his new apartment across town. She left dressed carefully, hopeful in the way people are when they're trying to save something fragile. Adrian told himself not to think about it. He turned off his phone, tried to work, tried to distract himself. 2 hours later, there was a knock at his door. When he opened it, Olivia stood there soaked from the rain, mascara faintly smudged beneath her eyes. She wasn't hysterical. She wasn't dramatic. She was tired. I couldn't stay, she said quietly. She didn't explain everything, but she didn't need to. The argument hadn't been explosive. It had been worse, indifferent. Marcus had spoken about future plans without asking what she wanted. He had assumed she would adjust. Again, Adrian stepped aside and let her in. They sat on the floor of his living room, backs against the couch, listening to rain strike the windows. She spoke slowly, carefully, as if saying the truth out loud might make it irreversible. I think I've been holding on to who we were instead of who we are. Adrian's chest tightened. Every word she spoke felt like hope wrapped in guilt. She didn't go home that night. Not because anything inappropriate happened. Nothing did. She simply fell asleep on his couch while he sat nearby, watching the steady rhythm of her breathing, understanding that something fundamental had cracked open. And for the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he was not just the quiet observer. Morning light has a way of clarifying things. When Olivia woke up in Adrian's apartment, there was a moment, brief but unmistakable, when reality settled heavily between them. She sat up slowly, running a hand through her hair, and for a second, neither spoke. We didn't do anything wrong, she said softly, as if reassuring herself. Adrian nodded, though his heart disagreed. Because emotionally, something had shifted beyond innocence. From that day forward, guilt threaded through their closeness. Not because they had crossed physical boundaries, they hadn't, but because emotional intimacy can be far more dangerous. She began confiding in him first. laughing with him first, seeking comfort from him first. Marcus noticed. Adrian could see it in the subtle tension when Marcus occasionally visited the building. The guarded glances, the polite but cold handshakes. Marcus wasn't blind, and neither was Olivia. One evening, she said quietly, "I feel like I'm already halfway gone." The words hung between them like a confession neither had expected to hear. Adrian wanted to respond with honesty, with the truth that had been burning inside him for months. But he stayed silent, because if she left Marcus, it had to be for herself, not for him. The end did not arrive dramatically. There were no screaming matches, no shattered objects, no slammed doors, just a quiet conversation in Marcus's apartment where Olivia finally admitted what she had been avoiding. "I don't feel chosen," she told him. Marcus argued. Promised change, promised effort, promised time. But love sustained by promises alone begins to feel like negotiation. When she walked out that night, it was not with anger, but with clarity. Adrian was sitting in his kitchen when she knocked on his door again. He knew before she spoke. He saw it in the way her shoulders had straightened, in the steadiness of her breathing. "It's over," she said. He felt relief. He felt fear. He felt hope so sharp it almost hurt. But instead of celebrating, he simply asked, "Are you okay?" And she nodded. For the first time, she truly was. Days passed in a fragile, unfamiliar calm. Without Marcus in the background, their connection felt different, lighter, but more exposed. There was no longer a barrier protecting them from the truth. They returned to the balcony one evening, the city glowing beneath them, winter slowly surrendering to early spring. Silence wrapped around them comfortably, but underneath it pulsed something undeniable. "I don't know when it started," Olivia said quietly, staring at the horizon. "But somewhere along the way, you became the person I look for first." Adrian's pulse thundered in his ears. He had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed words in his mind, prepared himself for rejection. But now that it was here, language felt fragile. "I've been in love with you for a long time," he admitted finally, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "I tried not to be. I told myself it wasn't fair. But it never stopped." She turned toward him slowly, eyes searching his face not with shock, but with understanding. Because she had known. Maybe not at first, but eventually. And when she leaned forward and rested her forehead gently against his, it wasn't impulsive. It was inevitable. Even after the confession, fear lingered like a shadow neither Adrian nor Olivia could ignore. Love had finally arrived, but it was fragile, untested, and frightening. Olivia hesitated before reaching for his hand, as though physical closeness might make her emotions more real than she was prepared to handle. Adrian noticed everything. The small pauses in her sentences, the way her gaze flicked toward the city lights before returning to him, the subtle tightening of her jaw whenever she tried to joke. Both of them were aware that months of restraint and silence had created a delicate tension, and now that the barrier had fallen, neither knew exactly how to navigate the freedom that came with truth. Every look, every word, every touch was heavier than it had ever been before. And Adrian, who had lived a life of control and order, felt the exhilarating terror of losing himself in another person for the first time. The first night they spent together was slow and hesitant, filled with unspoken promises rather than grand declarations. They didn't rush to physical intimacy. Instead, they sat side by side on the couch, shoulders brushing, their hands occasionally meeting and retreating again. Outside, the city hummed quietly, indifferent to the human vulnerability unfolding in Adrian's apartment. Olivia spoke softly about her past with Marcus, the moments she realized she had been trying to mold herself to fit someone else's expectations. Adrian listened, offering comfort without judgment, careful not to fill the silences with words that might ruin the delicate new equilibrium. When she finally leaned against his chest, resting her cheek on his shoulder, it wasn't just closeness, it was a declaration. The first night was not about passion, it was about trust, about two people cautiously daring to allow themselves to be seen. The next days brought the challenge of the outside world. Friends noticed changes in Olivia's demeanor, a lightness when she spoke, a quiet sparkle in her eyes when Adrian was near. Marcus had faded, leaving a void that was both liberating and terrifying. Work obligations and errands had to continue, but every interaction between Adrian and Olivia carried a depth that made ordinary life feel heightened. Even casual conversation could be electric. A lingering glance across a crowded street, a hand brushing against another while passing in the hallway, a shared smile that lasted longer than necessary. Each moment became layered with meaning, each silence heavy with potential. They were both learning to navigate intimacy that had once been forbidden, and the thrill of secrecy had been replaced by the vulnerability of openness, far more terrifying and far more intoxicating. No love story is complete without friction, and theirs arrived quietly, as arguments often do in long-term emotional entanglements. One evening, Olivia grew frustrated over a work issue and snapped at Adrian for no reason. His instinct was to remain calm, to smooth over the tension, but he realized that they were in uncharted territory. The conversation became heated, not in anger, but in the fear of losing each other. They shouted in low, controlled tones, emotions tightly coiled around every word. When the yelling stopped, they stared at one another in exhaustion. Tears welled in Olivia's eyes, and Adrian felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He realized, in that moment, that love was not about avoiding conflict but surviving it, about seeing the raw, unfiltered truth of someone else and still choosing them. That night, when they finally embraced, it was not as lovers celebrating passion. It was two souls reassuring one another that they were still present, still committed, and still willing to weather the storms together. The morning after their first argument brought clarity wrapped in vulnerability. They sat together on the balcony, sipping coffee, shoulders touching lightly as the sun rose and spilled golden light across the city. Words were unnecessary. Silence conveyed the understanding that had been forged the night before. Adrian reached for her hand, intertwining fingers, and Olivia allowed herself to lean in, her head resting briefly against his chest. For the first time, they felt not just love, but the gravity of choosing each other, fully aware of the risks and responsibilities that came with it. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer dominated. Instead, it had been tempered by honesty and shared experience. Every glance, every word, every subtle touch was a conscious affirmation. They had crossed the line from longing and restraint into something deeper, permanent, and entirely theirs. And in that golden morning light, the world outside seemed secondary. Their love, quiet and steady, had found its rhythm. In the days that followed, Adrian and Olivia discovered that love is not simply about closeness, it is about exposure. Every word she spoke, every glance he offered, became a test of courage. They spent evenings together in quiet apartments or under dim streetlights, speaking softly about dreams, fears, and past regrets. Yet each conversation carried unspoken stakes. Olivia would sometimes pause mid-sentence, searching Adrian's face for judgment or disappointment, and he would offer only steady reassurance. The intensity of vulnerability was almost overwhelming. They both understood that to love fully meant risking the possibility of loss, not just heartbreak, but the potential unraveling of trust they had built so carefully. Yet, in these small, tender exchanges, their bond deepened. Each revelation, each confession, each shared fear acted as cement in the foundation of a love neither had dared to name before, but now could not deny. Life outside their private world pressed against the fragile bubble of intimacy they had formed. Olivia received a message from Marcus, a polite inquiry about her well-being, a subtle reminder of obligations she had left unresolved. Adrian noticed the tension in her eyes when she read it, the tiny bite of her lip that betrayed worry she tried to hide. They discussed it openly, carefully navigating the minefield of residual loyalty and past commitments. Their conversation stretched late into the night, dissecting feelings, boundaries, and what it meant to fully embrace their connection without guilt. For the first time, Adrian realized that love was not about uninterrupted joy but about patience, compromise, and understanding that the past can never fully disappear. That evening, when they finally allowed themselves to rest, it was with the shared understanding that love is strongest not when effortless, but when chosen continuously in the face of fear. It was a rainy evening when Olivia leaned against Adrian in the living room, the sound of drops against the window blending with soft music in the background. She spoke quietly about her childhood, the small insecurities she had carried into adulthood, and the moments she had spent pretending to be someone else to please others. Adrian listened, heart aching with tenderness and longing. He told her, in turn, about the weight of solitude, the years he had spent meticulously planning life to avoid uncertainty, and the way she had shattered that careful structure simply by existing. Neither confession was dramatic, neither intended to impress. They were small, intimate truths shared in the quiet spaces where no one else could see. That night, they realized that intimacy is not defined by passion alone, but by the courage to reveal the self completely to another without fear of rejection. One evening, while walking home through the quiet streets, Adrian and Olivia found themselves in a deserted park, the city lights reflecting in puddles from the earlier rain. Without planning, Adrian took her hand, and for the first time, Olivia did not hesitate. The simple act of holding hands, of feeling the warmth of her palm against his, sent a shiver through both of them. They sat on a bench, speaking in whispers, letting silence fill the spaces between words. Adrian caught himself imagining a life entirely entwined with hers, a life where the fear of judgment or consequence no longer existed. And in that park, under the dim glow of streetlights and with the rain still clinging to the leaves, they understood something essential. Love is not declared once. It is chosen, moment by moment, and each choice matters more than the words that follow. The first kiss was neither rushed nor explosive. It happened after a long night of shared stories, laughter, and quiet confessions. They were standing on Adrian's balcony, the city sprawling below them like a sea of distant stars, and the air was still with expectation. Adrian gently took Olivia's face in his hands, their eyes meeting in silence that said more than speech ever could. When their lips finally met, it was deliberate and certain, a kiss that held every emotion they had restrained for months. Passion, yes, but also relief, tenderness, and an unspoken vow of presence. When they pulled away, their foreheads rested together, breathing mingling, hearts pounding in synchronized rhythm. The world outside did not matter. All that existed was the undeniable truth between them. The love they had hidden, nurtured, and feared was now alive, palpable, and impossible to ignore. Even as Adrian and Olivia embraced the depth of their connection, the past continued to whisper in the corners of their hearts. Messages from Marcus occasionally appeared, polite, indirect, careful, as if testing boundaries without breaking them. Olivia felt guilt gnaw at her during quiet moments, questioning whether stepping into this love so fully was fair. Adrian, meanwhile, battled a different kind of fear, the fear of becoming someone she might regret loving. They spoke openly about these feelings, sitting together for hours, sometimes in silence, sometimes in whispered dialogue. Each discussion reinforced their awareness that love is not simply the thrill of passion. It is also a test of endurance, trust, and the courage to face discomfort together. Every unspoken thought they revealed strengthened the fragile scaffolding of intimacy they were building, ensuring that what had once been hidden would not collapse under scrutiny. Love without conflict is rarely deep. One rainy evening, tension bubbled over in Adrian's kitchen. Olivia had misinterpreted a conversation Adrian had with a colleague, believing he was still distant or emotionally unavailable. Her voice trembled as frustration surfaced, not in anger at him personally, but in fear that she might be misreading their entire relationship. Adrian responded with calm intensity, struggling to convey that his silence was never indifference, but a habit born of years spent controlling his life meticulously. Words were exchanged, heated and heartfelt, until both felt raw and exhausted. Afterwards, they sat in the aftermath of emotional exposure, leaning against each other, realizing that trust is not the absence of arguments, but the ability to survive them. That night, tears and whispered apologies forged a stronger understanding, one that neither passion nor secrecy alone could have created. After the storm of the argument, days settled into a rhythm of quiet closeness. They lingered in spaces where the world could not intrude. Adrian's balcony in the early morning, the small kitchen table with sunlight spilling across half-empty mugs of coffee, the narrow park path where leaves rustled underfoot. During these moments, vulnerability was celebrated rather than feared. Olivia admitted fears she had carried for years, the lingering voice of self-doubt, the worry that she would always sacrifice her own happiness to avoid conflict. Adrian shared his own vulnerabilities, the loneliness of meticulous routines, the weight of always controlling the uncontrollable. And in these quiet exchanges, they discovered the joy of being fully known and fully accepted, the kind of intimacy that no previous relationship had offered. The reality of the outside world began pressing against their delicate bond. Friends and co-workers noticed the subtle shift in Olivia. The way her gaze lingered on Adrian, the laughter that seemed brighter, the warmth that had replaced her previous hesitation. Questions came gently, innocuously, about her happiness and her relationships. And though the scrutiny was mild, it reminded them both that the love they had nurtured in secrecy now had to contend with perception, judgment, and expectation. Each interaction with the outside world became a balancing act, testing the patience, understanding, and strength of their connection. They realized that love in the open is not easier than secret love. It is simply another test, one of persistence, courage, and unwavering honesty. One evening, as the city slept beneath them, Adrian and Olivia sat on the balcony with the warm glow of lamplight casting shadows across their faces. Neither spoke at first, letting the rhythm of night and their shared presence hold meaning. Finally, Olivia whispered, "I never realized how much I needed someone to see me completely, without pretense or expectation." Adrian brushed a strand of hair from her face, voice low and deliberate. "I see you, every part of you, and I will choose you every day, even when it's hard, even when it scares me." There was no dramatic flourish, no grand gesture, just two hearts aligned in understanding. That quiet declaration, spoken without fanfare, carried more weight than months of hidden longing. It was a promise rooted not in impulse, but in deliberate, conscious commitment, the kind of love that could survive storms, fear, and the weight of the past. In the days that followed their quiet declaration, Adrian and Olivia understood that love is not only about feeling, but about choosing every single day. Each morning, they woke not simply as lovers, but as companions navigating the unknown terrain of intimacy and vulnerability. Even small decisions, what to cook, when to meet, how much to share of their fears, became acts of trust. Adrian noticed how her laughter had grown richer, more relaxed, how her eyes lingered longer when she spoke of dreams and ambitions. Olivia noticed his subtle gestures, the way he adjusted her blanket when she slept, the way he prepared her coffee just the way she liked it without asking. Love was no longer the stolen, secret thing that had consumed them in anxious longing. It was deliberate, tangible, and fiercely tender, built on years of patience, restraint, and the courage to face uncertainty together. Life, of course, continued to challenge them. Work obligations, family pressures, and lingering remnants of the past tested the strength of their bond. A sudden visit from Marcus, polite but probing, reminded them of everything Olivia had left behind. Conversations about old friends and unfinished commitments occasionally stirred tension, fear, or guilt, but each challenge became a testament to their growing resilience. They learned to communicate without defensiveness, to express frustration without anger, and to hold one another through emotional turbulence. Slowly, Adrian realized that love was not proven in moments of comfort or passion, but in the quiet endurance of trials that no one else would ever witness. And in these moments, their bond solidified, a foundation not just of desire, but of steadfast understanding and mutual respect. One rainy evening, the city lights casting reflections across wet pavement, Olivia shared a secret she had never spoken aloud. Her fear of being unlovable, of repeating the mistakes of past relationships. She spoke with hesitant honesty, trembling slightly, exposing the raw edges of her soul. Adrian listened without interruption, holding her hand, allowing silence to validate her words instead of filling them with reassurance. When she finished, he whispered softly about his own fears, of isolation, of failing, of loving too deeply and being rejected. In that exchange, they discovered the extraordinary intimacy that comes only when two people allow themselves to be truly seen. Tears fell silently, and hands remained entwined. That night, they realized that love without vulnerability is hollow. It is courage, trust, and exposure that make the bond real. Months passed, and their relationship matured into something profound. It was not without mistakes, small arguments, and moments of doubt, but each challenge became an opportunity for growth. One evening, standing together on the balcony overlooking the city skyline, Adrian felt a surge of certainty as Olivia leaned her head on his shoulder. "I never imagined I could feel this safe," she said softly. Adrian kissed the top of her head, feeling a quiet fulfillment that went beyond desire. This was love in its purest form, not loud or performative, but steadfast, conscious, and fully mutual. They understood that choosing each other every day, even in mundane routines, in quiet mornings, in unremarkable moments, was the most radical act of devotion. And in that stillness, Adrian realized that the love he had nurtured in silence had transformed into a force capable of sustaining them through anything. The story did not end with fireworks or dramatic declarations. It ended with presence. Sitting together in the early morning light, coffee in hand, hands intertwined, Adrian and Olivia reflected on the journey that had brought them here. Years of unspoken longing, patient observation, emotional restraint, and quiet courage had converged into a love both gentle and unshakable. They understood that love is not always visible to the outside world, and that some of the deepest connections begin in silence and flourish only through deliberate choice. For anyone watching, listening, or wondering, their story whispered a truth. Sometimes, the love that feels impossible is the love most worth waiting for. It is not about urgency or spectacle, but about patience, honesty, and the willingness to see and be seen completely. And in that understanding, they found their forever, not because it was easy, but because it was real.